June 22, 1940. In a quiet forest outside Compiègne, history repeated itself, only crueler this time. The same railway carriage where Germany had once knelt in defeat now hosts the French delegation, pale, hollow-eyed, their pride bleeding out faster than the ink on the paper they're about to sign. 6 weeks. That's all it took to shatter a nation that once terrified Europe. 90,000 soldiers dead. 60,000 civilians erased. 10 million souls dragged south in the largest, most desperate human flood the continent had ever seen. Highways jammed with carriages, livestock, and corpses, a slow-motion collapse disguised as retreat. And here, in this cursed carriage, France finally exhales not in relief, but in exhaustion, in surrender. Across the Channel, Britain listens, and instead of bowing to the inevitable, they do something so reckless it borders on divine lunacy. They decide to fight on alone. The world watches in disbelief. How could an island bleeding from Dunkirk, stripped of tanks, guns, and reason, possibly stand against the Nazi machine? In Paris, German boots thunder through empty boulevards once built for parades. In Normandy, black smoke still claws the sky. In the south, refugees sleep in train stations that no longer have trains. Then comes the radio broadcast, Churchill's gravel voice cutting through static and despair. Britain will fight on. For a nation on its knees, the words hit like a slap. Some laughed bitterly, some cursed loudly, and some simply wept. Because if defeat had a sound, it was silence. And if madness had a name, it was Britain. The French civilians who heard that message didn't cheer. They argued. Was it courage or arrogance? Was it salvation or suicide? Their reactions would split the nation deeper than the German invasion ever could. And in their words, whispered in fear, written in shame, remembered in secret, lay the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, hope wears the mask of insanity. And sometimes, insanity is the only thing that keeps hope alive. In the cafes of Paris, conversation dies mid-sentence. The tricolor is gone, replaced overnight by banners of the swastika that flap like cruel jokes in the summer wind. A few men still order coffee as if nothing happened, because pretending feels easier than believing. Across the river, the radio crackles with German marches. Children point at soldiers in gray uniforms and ask if they're the good guys now. No one answers. In the countryside, the exodus drags on. Farmers abandon generations of soil for the illusion of safety further south. Bridges are blown, trains are packed, and every road smells of gasoline, sweat, and despair. France, the country of poets and revolutions, has become a moving refugee camp. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the British Empire holds its breath. The Dunkirk beaches are littered with rusting helmets and twisted metal reminders of how close collapse had come. Yet Churchill refuses to whisper defeat. He growls defiance. He dares Hitler to try. And the contrast couldn't be sharper. One nation kneels in silence. The other howls in fury. One signs the papers. The other tears them up. Inside France, people whisper that the English have lost their minds. But beneath the cynicism, beneath the bitterness, there's a tremor, the faint, forbidden thought that maybe madness is better than submission. A young teacher in Lyon writes in her diary, Marshal Pétain says peace is honor. But perhaps honor has nothing to do with peace. No one knows it yet. But that single line, that flicker of rebellion, is how resistance begins. Not with guns, not with speeches, but with doubt. And, in June 1940, doubt is the only weapon France still has left. Defeat doesn't happen all at once. It seeps like water through cracks in stone. And by late June 1940, France is drowning in it. Everywhere, the same sound repeats, not gunfire, not sirens, but the soft shuffle of people trying to adjust to humiliation. In Paris, cafes reopen under German banners. Chairs are straightened, tables wiped clean, as if dignity could be restored by habit. German officers drink the same wine once reserved for poets and revolutionaries. The waiters pour it anyway, heads down, voices steady, eyes hollow. Simone, 32, writes in her diary that she feels relieved The fighting has stopped. Her friends are alive. The bombs are silent. But the silence feels worse than the war. When she hears that Britain has refused to surrender, she writes another line. The English are mad. They'll be invaded in a month. Then what was the point of any of this? That question, what was the point, becomes the national refrain. A letter from Lyon reaches New York weeks later. A woman writes to her sister, her words dripping with bitterness. The British ran away at Dunkirk and left us to die. Now they say they'll fight on. Let them. We've had enough of heroes. Across the country, resentment festers. The British, once allies, now feel like distant hypocrites fighting speeches from the safety of their island while French cities burn under occupation. A joke spreads in Marseille Café. The British will fight to the last French soldier. People laugh, but no one smiles. Humor becomes camouflage for despair. In the unoccupied zone, the new Vichy government promises honor, order, tradition. 3 words that sound noble, but hide something rotten. Marshal Pétain calls the armistice a shield protecting France from destruction. Newspapers freshly censored praise his wisdom, his age, his calm. They speak of family, work, and faith. The slogans are everywhere, printed on every wall like commandments. And, for a country bleeding from chaos, obedience suddenly looks like comfort. After all, chaos had brought tanks. Order, at least, brings bread. But not everyone buys the story. In Brittany, a fisherman named Jean-Marie walks to the shore each evening, staring across the channel. His 2 sons are prisoners somewhere in Germany or worse. He doesn't know. When he hears Churchill's defiant speech, he doesn't curse, he listens. The wind carries the words over the sea, broken and distant, but clear enough. We shall never surrender. Jean-Marie mutters to his wife, then maybe this isn't over. For him, hope doesn't sound heroic. It sounds impossible, and that's why it matters. In the industrial cities, workers gather after shifts to whisper their own thoughts. One man says, the rich made peace with the Germans, but the English workers are still fighting. Maybe this war isn't over after all. The divide is brutal. The wealthy speak of stability. The poor speak of unfinished wars. And between them stands a silence no one dares to break. In occupied northern towns, radios are forbidden. Still, at night, people twist the dials to catch the BBC through the static. Curtains drawn, doors locked, hearts racing. The French service announces, La guerre continue. For a few seconds, the room fills with something dangerous belief. A fragile flame in a house full of spies. But belief alone can't feed a family. When morning comes, people return to work, pretending they never heard a thing. By August, the mood has settled into something darker than defeat acceptance. Shops reopen, schools teach new songs. Children draw German flags in art class. Vichy officials smile for photographs, claiming that France has found peace. But the photographs lie. You can see it in their eyes, that strange blend of relief and shame, the quiet understanding that peace achieved through surrender feels like standing perfectly still while someone else holds the gun. And in that stillness, France begins to rot. The newspapers tell people Britain will fall within weeks. They print maps showing German bombers over London, headlines screaming about British stubbornness. But behind the propaganda, a few readers notice something odd. The tone sounds nervous. If Germany's victory were certain, why repeat it every day? In a small library in Clermont-Ferrand, a librarian whispers to her husband. If they were so sure, they wouldn't need to say it so often. It's the kind of remark that could get you arrested. But she says it anyway, because beneath the rubble of defeat, France is still thinking quietly, dangerously. Defeat has many sounds: the clatter of boots, the rattle of trains, the low hum of a nation pretending to move on. But the loudest sound of all is doubt. And doubt, once it begins to speak, never truly shuts up. The loudest sound of all is doubt. And once it takes root, it grows everywhere, in cafes, in fields, in the hush between radio broadcasts. By late summer 1940, that doubt begins to change shape. It becomes something smaller, quieter, but infinitely more dangerous. It becomes hope. Not the kind they print on posters or shout in parades. The kind that hides behind curtains and whispers when the world sleeps. In Brittany, Jean-Marie still walks to the same stretch of beach every evening. He watches the horizon where sea meets sky, wondering if his sons are alive somewhere beyond it. When the tide brings in bits of wreckage, a plank of wood, a military crate with English writing, he takes it as a sign. He tells his wife, "If the English are still fighting, then the war isn't finished." "Not yet." She doesn't answer. She just sets 2 plates on the table instead of 4. Because believing costs more than surrender ever did. Across the unoccupied zone, in the towns Pétain calls free, the air smells of ink and propaganda. Newspapers declare that Britain will collapse any day. Every headline screams the same word, inevitable. But inevitability is a fragile illusion. Even the most obedient minds start to wonder why the same prediction needs repeating every morning. In Toulouse, a schoolteacher opens class with the usual patriotic lecture about honor and obedience. But when she reads from the official textbook, Marshal Pétain has saved France from ruin, something inside her hesitates. The words feel heavy, false. That night she writes in her diary, "If peace means silence, then I prefer the noise of resistance." In the industrial city of Saint-Étienne, the workers drink in dim bars, arguing politics they no longer dare speak at work. Someone says, "The bosses are shaking hands with the Germans, but the English workers are still fighting. Maybe the war isn't done after all." The others laugh not because it's funny, but because laughter is safer than belief. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Germans try to turn occupation into routine. They smile in shops. They pay for cigarettes. They sit in cafes where French lovers once whispered revolutions. But beneath the surface, the city hums with invisible defiance. Every night, shutters close early. Every night, radios click on. The BBC's French service begins with the same phrase, "La guerre continue." The war continues. People risk prison for those 3 words. They listen with the volume low, faces lit by the faint blue glow of the dial. To an outsider, it looks like superstition. To them, it's oxygen. One night, the broadcast speaks of British planes bombing Berlin. No one knows if it's true, but that's not the point. Truth doesn't matter when imagination is all that's left. For a few precious minutes, they imagine German cities burning instead of French ones, and that's enough to fall asleep feeling almost alive. In cafes the next morning, someone will whisper, "Did you hear? The English bombed Berlin." Someone else will shrug, pretending not to care. But behind that shrug hides the first spark of something new faith. By autumn, the battle has moved north to the skies over Britain. German bombers roar across the Channel every night. The newspapers in Vichy call it the end of British arrogance. But the end doesn't come. Instead, reports leak through. The RAF is fighting back, shooting down bombers faster than Germany can replace them. In the propaganda offices of Vichy, editors start reusing the same headlines because they've run out of victories to print. The confident tone begins to crack. A farmer watching German newsreels in a village cinema notices something odd. Yes, the films show British cities burning, but they also show something else. They show British people refusing to run. They show firemen smiling, women singing in shelters, children waving at the cameras. The farmer leans to his neighbor and mutters, "Strange. For people who are losing, they don't look much like losers." Across France, that thought spreads like wildfire in dry grass. No one dares to say it out loud, but everyone feels it. Maybe, just maybe, the English aren't finished. By winter 1940, the mood begins to shift. Not enough to fill the streets with banners, but enough to change the silence. In the cafes, the laughter sounds different. In the markets, people speak softer when Germans walk by. The fear is still there, but now it has company, a quiet, stubborn hope that refuses to die. It doesn't make the food return, or the missing sons, or the shame fade away. But it gives people something they haven't felt since the invasion choice. To believe, or not to stay silent, or whisper, to wait, or act. No one calls it resistance yet. But that's what it is, not a movement, but a mood. And in a country where every word is watched, A mood can be the most subversive weapon of all. Hope, fragile as it is, never survives untouched. July 3rd, 1940. The same British voices that had whispered courage into occupied France now speak with cannon fire. At Mers el-Kebir, a harbor in Algeria, the Royal Navy surrounds the French fleet ships that were once their allies. Britain fears those vessels will fall into German hands. They demand the French surrender or sail to British ports. The French admiral refuses. The standoff lasts hours. Then the British open fire. The sea turns red. Battleships explode where sailors are still eating breakfast. Bodies wash ashore tangled in oil and rope. 1,297 French sailors die not by German bombs, but by British shells. When the news reaches France, disbelief turns to fury. Even those who admired Britain's defiance now feel the stab of betrayal. The headlines scream treachery. Posters bloom overnight. British warships firing on French sailors, Union Jacks dripping in blood. The radio calls it proof of English arrogance. And for once, people agree. In Paris cafes, the jokes stop. A man slams his glass on the counter and shouts, "They claim to fight tyranny and murder their friends instead." A woman in Bordeaux writes in her diary, "I wanted to believe the English were our hope. Now I know they're no better than the Germans." Even secret BBC listeners hesitate that night. The sound of the broadcast feels different, colder. The voice that once meant defiance now sounds like hypocrisy. The Vichy government seizes the moment. Pétain calls the attack a crime against honor. Posters declare France betrayed by Britain, saved by Pétain. In the streets, German officers smile politely, shaking hands with locals who suddenly prefer them to the English. The shift is instant and terrifyingly effective. Within days, the emotional map of France redraws itself. Where there was doubt, now there is rage. Where there was hope, now there is hate. And propaganda doesn't even need to lie, only to remind. Remind them of Dunkirk. Remind them how the British ran while France bled. Remind them who shelled their sailors. For once, truth and manipulation march side by side. Even in villages far from the coast, the anger burns. Church sermons condemn British pride masquerading as virtue. Schoolteachers tell their students that Pétain's peace spared them from British bullets. Mothers whisper to children that the English cannot be trusted. A resistance sympathizer in Lyon writes in secret, "The hardest thing now isn't to hate the Germans. It's to stop hating the English. That's what betrayal does. It poisons the heart faster than fear ever could." And yet, beneath the fury, something strange happens. Not everyone stays angry. Some, after the first wave of shock, begin to think. A librarian in Clermont-Ferrand notices the pattern. Every newspaper insists Britain will be destroyed within weeks. But they've said that for a month now. And the British? They're still standing. She tells her husband quietly. If Germany was winning, they wouldn't have to shout so loudly about it. That single sentence, whispered in private, carries more subversion than any speech. In the countryside, peasants gather at markets, trading bread for rumors. Some insist Britain is doomed. Others claim Churchill has a secret weapon. No one knows. But the very act of wondering, of doubting the propaganda, becomes its own rebellion. Meanwhile, in occupied Paris, a baker named Henri hears about Mers el-Kebir and feels torn in two. His brother was in the Navy. His friends tell him to curse the English. But each night, he turns on his hidden radio and listens anyway. He can't explain why. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's hope. Maybe it's because betrayal doesn't erase admiration, it only makes it painful. The BBC reports that Britain regrets the loss of French lives, but had no choice. Henri doesn't believe the justification. He doesn't believe the regret either. And yet, when the broadcast ends with the words, "The fight continues," he feels something twist inside him. Not hatred, but longing. Because beneath the anger, a question refuses to die. If the English are truly monsters, why are they still fighting alone? By August, the rage starts to fade, not because it's forgiven, but because it's exhausting. Hate, like war, demands too much energy to maintain forever. People return to work. They fix roofs, repair walls, bury their dead. The anger lingers, but dulls into weariness. And when night falls, the radios turn on again. Softly, carefully, guiltily. The same gravel voice returns, as if nothing happened. We shall never surrender. No one believes it completely. But no one can stop listening either, because even in betrayal, even in blood, something in the British tone refuses to die, a defiance that sounds almost human. And the French, humiliated and furious, recognize themselves in it. They won't admit it yet, but in the privacy of their hearts, they begin to remember what defiance once felt like. The French had seen enough to know how stories like this end. When an empire stands alone against a machine, it gets crushed. That's how it always goes until it doesn't. By August 1940, the bombers come. Hundreds of them. Every night, the Luftwaffe crosses the channel, filling the British sky with fire. German newsreels play in every cinema across France, London burning, Coventry flattened, smoke pouring from cathedrals. The narrators speak with rehearsed certainty. England trembles. The end is near. In cafes, people nod. In their hearts, they wait. Because they've heard this story before. Poland, Norway, Belgium, France, every country that stood against Germany had been erased in weeks. Surely Britain would be next. But then, something odd happens. Weeks pass, then months, and Britain does not fall. At first, the newspapers call it temporary resistance, then stubborn delay, then silence. The word inevitable quietly disappears from the headlines. In Vichy, editors start to reuse old propaganda photographs because there are no new victories to print. The radio's tone changes to still confident, but thinner, like a man whistling in the dark. And in that dark, something inside France begins to stir again. A farmer in Auvergne goes to the village cinema. He watches a German newsreel showing the nightly bombings, the firestorms, the ruins, the endless barrage, but the film also shows something else. Firemen working without panic, children smiling in shelters, Churchill walking through rubble as if the flames were background decoration. The farmer leans toward his neighbor and mutters, "For people who are losing, they don't look much like losers." The comment spreads, first whispered, then repeated, then believed. In Marseille, a factory worker listens to the BBC at midnight. He knows it's illegal. He's wrapped the radio in a blanket to muffle the sound. He hears about German bombers shot down, British pilots celebrated by name. He doesn't know if the stories are true, but the confidence in the voice feels real. It's the sound of a man who still believes he can win. That voice does what no bullet can. It cracks through despair. Across the unoccupied zone, people start listening again. Carefully, curiously, desperately. In Paris, Henri the baker keeps his habit. Every night, after closing the shop, he turns the dial to catch the BBC through the static. Now, the reports speak of the Battle of Britain, a phrase that sounds mythic, as if the island itself had become a soldier. He imagines those small planes, those pilots barely out of boyhood, climbing into burning skies again and again. And for the first time since the armistice, he feels something he thought had died. Respect, not for politics, for courage. He doesn't talk about it, not to his wife, not to his customers, not even to himself. But the next morning, he hums an old marching tune while baking bread. His assistant notices. He doesn't ask why. Meanwhile, in Vichy, the regime doubles down. Pétain's ministers call Britain a stubborn corpse still twitching. They warn that resistance sympathizers are infected by British propaganda. They print posters showing German pilots smiling beside British ruins, the caption reading, "Better them than us." But the fear in those posters is louder than the message. People can smell it, that sour scent of uncertainty spreading through the official confidence. The Germans themselves seem uneasy. They patrol more often. They search houses at random. They arrest anyone caught listening to enemy broadcasts. In Lyon, a woman is imprisoned for saying out loud, "I hope Britain wins." 6 months. No trial. No appeal. But the damage is done. Her neighbors heard her words. They heard her vanish. And they remember, because sometimes The simplest sentence, "I hope Britain wins," can echo louder than bombs. By late autumn, even the most loyal Vichy supporters begin to hedge their bets. A businessman who once toasted Pétain now tells clients, "I always said the British were brave men." A priest who preached submission now slips hope for liberation into his prayers. The same people who mocked British madness now speak of British endurance. Nothing about their lives has changed. The Germans are still in charge, the ration lines still long, the fear still real. But the psychological tide has turned. Britain's survival has become France's secret victory. And in that quiet, dangerous pride, something new is born, not open rebellion yet, but identity, the sense that if one nation can refuse to kneel, maybe another can too. In the winter of 1940, Paris is cold and gray. German officers stroll under the Eiffel Tower, pretending it belongs to them. They don't notice the glances. They don't hear the whispers. A few streets away, a young man paints a small V on a wall. V for Victoire. He does it at night, with shaking hands. It's meaningless, suicidal, foolish, but it makes him feel alive. The next morning, someone paints another, then another. Soon, the letter appears everywhere, a ghost of defiance the occupiers can't erase fast enough. That's how hope works. It doesn't march. It seeps. It infects. It spreads, one whisper, one symbol, one sleepless night at a time. The French no longer believe Britain will fall. They've seen the sky burn and refuse to break. And deep down, they start to realize something terrifying and liberating at once. If Britain can survive the impossible, maybe surrender wasn't the only option after all. Maybe surrender wasn't the only option after all. But in 1941, saying that out loud could still get you killed. France had become two countries, sharing one name. To the north, the occupied zone, ruled by German boots and curfews. To the south, the unoccupied zone, ruled by Pétain's sermons and fear. One half obeyed orders from Berlin. The other half obeyed orders pretending not to come from Berlin. Every street, every home, every dinner table was split the same way. In Paris, collaboration was easy to justify. The city needed bread, electricity, routine. Cafes reopened. Fashion returned. Even under occupation, the French found ways to look civilized as if style could hide shame. German officers sipped champagne at Maxim's, while French waiters bowed and pretended not to see their reflection in the glass. A journalist wrote, "We must preserve French culture, even under German guidance." He wasn't a traitor, not in his mind. He was a pragmatist, a survivor, and survival had become the new patriotism. Across the river, another France was forming, invisible, disorganized, but alive. Young men hiding in barns, old soldiers keeping stolen radios, priests smuggling letters. They had no flag, no uniforms, no grand speeches, just a shared conviction whispered like a prayer. This isn't over. They called themselves resistance, but the word was still dangerous, spoken only in shadows. One night, a woman named Lucy hides a British pilot whose plane was shot down near Paris. She feeds him bread, gives him her husband's coat, and risks execution by doing so. When asked later why she helped, she says, "Because when we surrendered, they didn't." In another neighborhood, a woman reports her neighbor for the same act, hiding an enemy pilot. The Gestapo drags the man away before dawn. When questioned, she says, "He broke the law. The marshal wants peace." She believes it. She's not a monster. She's a woman trying to survive. That's what makes this chapter unbearable. Both sides thought they were saving France. One by resisting chaos, the other by resisting tyranny. Both right. Both wrong. In Vichy itself, loyalty becomes a currency. Officials swear oaths to Pétain's national revolution. Posters appear everywhere. Work, family, fatherland. 3 words meant to sound holy and to replace the ones carved into the Republic's heart. Liberty, equality, fraternity. But liberty doesn't die overnight. It dies in 1,000 small compromises, each one made with the best of intentions. A police chief in Lyon signs orders to round up undesirables. He tells himself he's protecting the city from German anger. A teacher removes passages about democracy from her lessons. She tells herself it's temporary. A factory owner supplies metal to the Wehrmacht. He tells himself it's business. And yet, beneath the obedience, something stubborn keeps beating. British broadcasts talk about Free France, about a general named Charles de Gaulle rallying exiles in London. Most people laugh. A general without an army? Ridiculous. But a few don't laugh. A few listen. A few write down the address of a secret post box, the contact of a courier, a code word whispered at a train station. They don't expect victory. They just refuse to be silent. By 1942, the division is no longer metaphorical. It's physical. German troops march into the southern zone, ending even the illusion of independence. Now the whole country kneels under one boot. The Vichy government promises cooperation will bring protection. Instead, it brings deportation. Jewish families vanish overnight. Trains roll east, unmarked, unexplained. The stations fill with silence. Some pretend not to see. Others can't stop seeing. A priest in Toulouse hides children in his church basement. When asked why, he says, "The English are still fighting." That means God hasn't left Europe yet. His words spread quietly, repeated like scripture. Not about politics, about endurance. Meanwhile, resistance begins to organize. Small cells merge, codes multiply, leaflets circulate. They print on stolen paper, using church wine for ink. The messages are simple. France is not dead. Keep faith. Do not listen to the radio of lies. For every leaflet printed, someone disappears. For every whisper, someone is arrested. But for every arrest, two more whisper. Courage, like fear, is contagious. By now, everyone knows someone who's chosen a side. A friend who joined the Milice Pétain's secret police. A cousin who vanished into the mountains with the Maquis. A neighbor whose husband never returned from Germany. The front line isn't at the border anymore. It runs through every home. In Paris, Henri, the baker, keeps baking for the occupiers, but he listens to the BBC every night. He's careful. He smiles when German soldiers buy his bread, but once they leave, he slices the next loaf with just a little too much force. He doesn't call it resistance, but it feels like it. In Marseille, dock workers sabotage shipments meant for the Germans. They spill fuel, mislabel crates, delay departures. Tiny acts, invisible to history, but enormous to those who risk their lives doing them. In Lyon, the librarian who once doubted propaganda now helps print underground papers. Every issue could mean execution. She does it anyway. And yet, even as defiance grows, so does hypocrisy. People trade loyalty like ration cards depending on who's listening. The same man who salutes German officers at noon might shelter a Jewish family by night. The same woman who reports a neighbor might later hide her own son from the draft. Morality becomes a blur, no longer measured by slogans, only by survival. The resistance itself begins to fracture communists, Gaullists, royalists, all fighting for a future none of them can yet define. But unity isn't the point. The point is persistence. By late 1942, a new phrase circulates through occupied France. Better to die standing than live on your knees. No one knows who said it first. But everyone knows what it means. And slowly, painfully, the two Frances, the one that obeys and the one that resists, start to recognize each other not as enemies, but as possibilities. Two halves of a nation waiting to see which one survives. At night, when the air raids echo from far away, people look up. The sky doesn't burn the way it used to. Somewhere beyond the clouds, British bombers fly not over Paris yet, but close enough to hear. Their engines sound heavy, distant, relentless. And for many French civilians, that sound becomes something sacred. Not destruction, not death, but proof that the world hasn't finished fighting. They still hate the Germans. They still mistrust the English. But for the first time since 1940, they believe in something larger than either side. They believe in endurance. They believe in endurance. And endurance, more than courage, more than victory, is what saves a nation. By 1943, The war has turned. The Allies are pushing back in North Africa. Russia is bleeding the German army dry. And Britain, the island everyone expected to sink, is still there, still breathing, still unbroken. The same voices that once mocked British madness now repeat it with reverence. Because madness that survives long enough stops looking insane. It starts looking like faith. Across France, small acts of defiance become habits. A shopkeeper who hides ration cards. A student who draws a V on a wall and doesn't bother to wipe it clean. A priest who prays in Latin because it's the one language the occupiers don't understand. Defiance stops being strategy. It becomes muscle memory. In Lyon, the librarian who once doubted now runs a full underground press. She prints stories of RAF victories, of Free French units fighting in Africa, of resistance fighters sabotaging trains. Every copy she makes could be her last. But she keeps printing not because she thinks it will change the war, but because she refuses to vanish quietly. In Bordeaux, a family debates in whispers. The father supports Pétain. He believes obedience saved them from annihilation. His sons are different. They slip out at night, carrying messages for the Maquis. They never tell him where they go. He never asks. Love becomes another form of silence. And in that silence, France waits, not knowing what it's waiting for. Then comes June 6th, 1944. D-Day. The radios explode with static and disbelief. The English are back with Americans, with Canadians, with an army the size of a miracle. Beaches, once soaked in retreat, now run red with invasion. Normandy burns again, but this time, the fire feels holy. In Paris, Henri the baker hears the news and laughs for the first time in years. Not because he's safe he isn't, but because history, at last, has changed direction. He goes outside, looks at the German soldiers on patrol, and for the first time, doesn't feel afraid. He just feels done. The resistance rises openly now. Trains explode, bridges collapse, and walls bloom with messages. France lives. The occupiers respond with fury arrests, executions, massacres, but the fear no longer works. The illusion of German invincibility has cracked, and nothing terrifies a tyrant more than disbelief. When Paris is finally liberated, the city erupts. Crowds flood the streets, flags reappear. Tears and laughter merge into the same sound. No one remembers who collaborated, who resisted, who simply survived. For a moment, everyone is French again. But victory brings its own kind of silence. When the shouting stops, the guilt begins. Neighbors eye each other. Old secrets crawl back into daylight. Some who fought are forgotten. Some who obeyed rewrite their memories into heroism. The moral clarity everyone dreamed of never arrives. Because the war didn't divide saints and traitors. It divided humans, and humans are messy. A woman in Paris, whose brother died at Mers-el-Kébir, still refuses to forgive the English. A man who praised British courage in 1940 becomes a collaborator in 1942, convinced Germany would win. A family in Normandy splits father loyal to Vichy, sons in the resistance, daughter in love with a German officer. History doesn't judge them kindly, but history wasn't there. In Provence, a journalist interviews an old woman in 1945. He asks what she thought when Britain chose to fight on while France surrendered. She closes her eyes, remembering. "I thought they were mad," she says. "I thought they'd be destroyed. I thought we all would." She pauses, then adds softly, "But maybe madness was what the world needed." The reporter leans forward. "You mean hope?" She shakes her head. "No, hope is polite. Hope waits for permission. What the English had wasn't hope. It was defiance. The kind that looks like insanity until it works." She looks out the window at a country rebuilding, at ruins being swept away, at children who have no memory of occupation. We needed someone to be crazy enough to say no, because we couldn't anymore. That's what the French civilians learned in those years, that reason doesn't always save you. Sometimes it's reason that kills you, whispering, it's useless to resist. And sometimes survival begins with the refusal to be reasonable. History books will call it the fall of France. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't a fall. It was a descent, slow, human, and painfully conscious. They felt every inch of it. They watched themselves break. And somehow, some of them kept breathing anyway. When the war ends, the world rebuilds and moves on. The Germans leave. The British go home. The Americans pack up their optimism and cigarettes. But the French remain standing in the ruins, trying to make sense of what they became. Some build monuments. Some build excuses. Most build silence. And yet, in that silence, one truth lingers like the aftertaste of smoke, that the difference between surrender and survival is sometimes just one voice saying no, not wisely, not rationally, but stubbornly, because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that fear won't make the final call. The French civilians who lived through 1940 didn't know they were living inside history. They weren't heroes or villains. They were just people terrified, exhausted, and still capable of wonder. They were trying to understand what it meant to lose everything and still find meaning in the ashes. And in that, they weren't so different from us. Because every generation faces its own version of 1940. A moment when the sky seems about to fall, when reason says surrender, and something deeper whispers, fight on.